It's one thing to rule the present. Anyone can do that, really. That's just crisis management. You're just reacting to whatever's on fire right in front of you. But the real shift, the thing that makes a true leader, is when you stop reacting and you start strategically preparing for the future. It's that moment a government goes from just surviving day to day to actually building an institutional architecture. That's where history gets made.
And that shift is, well, it's precisely the period we're diving into today. After the really difficult internal conflicts that marked the consolidation of the early Islamic State, Abu Bakr As-Siddiq didn't just, declare victory and say, back to business.
Right. He knew that wasn't enough.
Exactly. He recognized that military success, it just buys you time. That's all. Sustainable stability, that requires actual governmental design.
So he wasn't just governing for his own 2-year term. He was looking way beyond that. He was setting precedents, building these constitutional frameworks and operational standards that would end up guiding this vast empire long, long after he was gone.
That's it.
So if our last deep dive was about, say, putting the bricks and mortar in place, the administrative structure, who gets appointed, what departments exist, then this dive is all about the quality control. It's about the mechanics, the blueprints, and the long-term sustainability of that structure. It's the birth of Islamic public policy.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is to focus completely on these constitutional decisions of Abu Bakr As-Siddiq, specifically cases 65 through 72. These are the foundational policies, the standards that are absolutely necessary for a state to function with integrity and with foresight. We're exploring how he established these permanent rules of engagement for administration, for finance, for accountability, everything needed to ensure the system could outlive its founder.
And outlive its initial, geographical scope.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Where did we begin? The first foundational pillar seems to be Case 65. And this deals with the intellectual framework for how you even create laws and policies in the first place. We talk a lot about the great decisions leaders make, but this is a decision about how all future decisions must be made. Permanently.
And that's what's so fascinating here. It's this deliberate move toward systematization. Before this period of consolidation, policy could be a bit more fluid. It often revolved around an immediate consultation with the Prophet, peace be upon him, or, rapid localized responses to whatever popped up.
Right, reacting to the moment.
Yes. And while consultation, or Shura, was always there, Case 65 formalized it. It made it a permanent procedural requirement. It cemented the idea that public policy has to be deliberate, it has to be consultative, and critically, it must be grounded in established legal and religious sources.
So you're basically institutionalizing wisdom. You're creating a process to prevent bad, impulsive decisions. The sources are clear on this. Policy had to be rooted first in the Qur'an, then the Prophet's Sunnah, and only then could you get into reasoned, collaborative debate. But what does procedural requirement really mean back then, in the 7th century? How is this formalized shura any different from, say, the informal chats leaders were already having?
Well, that's the core of the decision, isn't it? It defined who had to be in the room and how their input was weighted. This wasn't just a council of war anymore. This was, for all intents and purposes, a legislative body. The procedure mandated that you had to include senior companions who had specialized knowledge.
Okay. So not just loyal friends.
Not at all. You needed the jurists, the scholars of finance, the military strategists, the people who could ensure that any legal interpretation was actually consistent with the primary sources. So, for instance, if you're framing a policy on zakat collection or figuring out the governance for a new province.
Which would be happening all the time.
All the time. The discussion had to move beyond what was politically convenient. It had to achieve a scholarly consensus on the legality of what was being proposed.
That's a huge structural check on power. So if you're defining these really complex policies, like, say, internal security or rules for governors dealing with totally new populations, the process itself acts as a kind of early form of legislative due diligence.
It's precisely that. It was a mechanism designed to prevent legal and administrative chaos across these rapidly expanding territories. Think about it. If a governor down in Yemen is interpreting a ruling one way and a governor over in Iraq sees it differently,
you've got a problem. The state starts to fragment.
You've got a big problem. But the codified decisions that came out of the structured consultation in Case 65, they provided a unified, traceable, and legally consistent reference point for everyone. The key lesson, and the sources really drive this home, is that policy has to be deliberate. It has to be grounded in authority. It can never be impulsive. This framework ensures the government is built on law, not on the shifting personal whims of whoever happens to be in charge.
It really does sound like the establishment of the first sort of cabinet policy review process. It guarantees that every decision is justified, it's documented, and it has a clear legal lineage. I mean, that's just foundational for any state.
It's absolutely foundational, and the modern relevance is just immense. When we talk today about legislative drafting, the multiple readings a bill goes through, committee reviews, expert witness testimony, all of that is continuation of this foundational need established in Case 65. That consultative process is the ultimate structural check on unilateral authority.
Okay, so that sets the policy framework. That's how you make decisions. Now let's jump to Case 67, which is about how the state handles its money. Governmental resource allocation, or, as the outline puts it, justice in the budget. Because you can draft the most brilliant policies in the world, but if the state budget is seen as corrupt or just fundamentally unfair, all trust in that governing structure just collapses.
Absolutely. The budget is where policy becomes reality. It's the operationalization of your principles. And Case 67 focused on creating these clear, strict guidelines for the equitable distribution of public wealth. It fundamentally established that state funds were not the personal piggy bank of the ruling elite. The decision was about constitutionalizing how revenue was classified and, just as important, who got prioritized for disbursement.
And the criteria for that distribution are really telling. It was based on a combination of need, merit, and equity. That sounds great in theory, but how did they practically assess that? I mean, how do you balance those complex factors across these huge newly integrated territories?
This is where we start seeing the early hints of what would become the Diwan system, the registers of public funds and entitlements. The decision mandated meticulous record-keeping, not just of how much money was coming in, but of the social topography of the state. Officials were required to identify and register specific categories of the needy. The distribution wasn't just a flat handout to everyone, it was strategic.
And what were those specific priorities? We know zakat funds were a big part of this.
Yes, and the source gives us really specific insight into how this prioritization was designed to maximize social cohesion. Zakat funds, which are inherently tied to this idea of purification and social good, were specifically channeled toward the most vulnerable groups. We're talking about the identified indigent, widows, orphans, new converts, who might be really struggling economically after changing their faith, and also entire regions that were identified as particularly needy or, recovering from conflict.
So it's not just wealth distribution. It's targeted fiscal policy. You're aiming it at stabilizing the most volatile or vulnerable parts of society. That's a pretty sophisticated tool for social engineering.
It is. This decision institutionalized the moral contract between the state and the people. By prioritizing these vulnerable groups, the state ensured that the marginalized felt a direct, immediate, and measurable benefit from the central authority. And this was so critical for state formation. It provided a tangible demonstration of justice that went beyond just personal allegiance to the ruler. People saw the system working for them.
And the constitutional implication is crystal clear. This decision set a permanent standard for fiscal responsibility. It established that the primary function of state revenue is social justice and the protection of the weak.
Exactly. The lesson here that fair distribution builds a just, socially cohesive society is absolutely paramount. If people trust that the state's resource allocation is fair, they invest their allegiance and their effort back into that state. In a modern context, this translates directly to strategic budget planning, fiscal policy designed to minimize regional disparities, and structuring welfare programs not as charity, but as a mandatory state function tied to the public good. It established that a functioning state needs both policy coherence and economic equity. You can't have one without the other.
So if Section 1 gave us the blueprint for what the state should do, how it should think, and how it should spend, then Section 2 seems to pivot to how the state makes sure its officials are actually doing it. How do you ensure they're performing effectively and ethically? Which brings us to Case 66. Administrative quality control. It's one thing to appoint a governor. It's a whole other thing to monitor what he's doing 1,000 miles away.
And this is where the real managerial sophistication starts to emerge. They were overcoming the limitations of, pre-modern communication technology. Abu Bakr instituted formal, systematic performance evaluations for all high-ranking officials. Governors, military commanders, key administrators. And this wasn't just, anecdotal monitoring or hearing rumors. It was designed as a procedural check on centralized power.
Okay, I need some clarity here. The source mentions that reviews were conducted monthly or seasonally. Now, given the immense distances and the fact they're relying on horses and camels, how is that even logistically possible? A monthly review for a provincial governor? Did the system rely on special envoys, or was the standard maybe a bit more localized than it sounds?
That's a crucial technical question, and the answer is it relied heavily on both. First, the evaluation was based on documented reports. The governors were mandated to file administrative and, very importantly, financial reports with the central authority. So that mandated paperwork was the first layer of accountability.
The paper trail.
The paper trail. But second, and perhaps more importantly, the system relied on these traveling envoys. Trusted agents, often senior companions or specialized auditors, who would travel either unannounced or on a seasonal circuit. Their job was to gather firsthand intelligence. They would observe judicial proceedings, they'd check the treasury accounts, and crucially, they would listen directly to the people.
So the people themselves become part of this quality control feedback loop. If the public is complaining about corruption or injustice, the traveling envoy records it and takes it straight back to the caliph. That's effectively an early ombudsman system reporting directly to the top.
Precisely. This layered approach compensated for the communication delays. The frequency monthly written reports combined with these seasonal external checks, it ensured that problems were caught early, before they could destabilize an entire province or an entire army command. And the real constitutional weight of Case 66 lies in the consequence for failure.
Which was?
Well, the source is explicit. The consequence for negligence or corruption was clear, and it was immediate removal from office. This enforced the principle that administrative duty was a sacred trust. It was not a lifetime appointment, and it certainly wasn't an inherited right. It established the permanent principle of official accountability to the central authority, and through those envoys, accountability to the citizens.
That is accountability with some serious teeth. The threat of a swift public removal from office would absolutely ensure that those distant officials were sticking to the standards set in the capital. The key lesson here, that accountability ensures continuity and integrity. It becomes the very definition of managerial control.
It established that internal mechanism that prevented the necessary centralization of authority from degrading into, unchecked tyranny or localized corruption. And we can draw such strong parallels to contemporary practices. Think about civil service evaluations, departmental audits, or the role of an inspector general or an auditor general in modern governments. All of these functions exist to apply the core principle of Case 66. Performance has to be monitored, it has to be measured, and negligence must have consequences.
Okay, so Case 66 tells us if you failed, you were out. Now let's connect that quality control mechanism with Case 71, setting performance standards for governance. Because quality control is totally meaningless if you haven't first clearly defined what quality actually looks like in practice.
Case 71 is that definition phase. It's the shift from subjective assessment, is he a good guy, to objective measurement. Abu Bakr defined clear, measurable benchmarks for administrative excellence across several critical sectors. This was to ensure officials knew exactly what was expected of them, and this wasn't, vague aspirational language, it was operational specification.
What were these benchmarks? The outline lists 4 critical areas: judicial justice, quality of service, financial integrity, and overall administrative integrity. Can we break that down? What did tangible results look like for a 7th century governor in these areas?
Well, let's take judicial justice. That meant minimizing court backlogs. It meant ensuring prompt, fair enforcement of rulings. The tangible result wasn't just about the number of cases you resolved, but the absence of high-profile, unresolved injustices being reported back to the capital by those envoys we just talked about.
So success is the absence of complaint.
In part, yes. For quality of service, that could cover infrastructure maintenance, ensuring travel routes were safe, making sure essential goods reached the populace without excessive taxation or theft by officials.
And financial cleanliness. That sounds like a pretty clear, measurable metric.
It was essentially an anti-corruption metric. It mandated strict transparency in the treasury and in zakat collection. The standard was zero tolerance for misappropriation. Officials were required to account for every single coin, ensuring that the resources that were allocated back in Case 67 were actually reaching the people they were intended for. The standard was so high that failure often meant not just removal, but judicial action as well.
This really emphasizes action over rhetoric, doesn't it? A governor couldn't just claim to be pious or politically loyal. They had to demonstrate efficiency in the courts, cleanliness in the treasury, and effective service delivery to the people. This must have completely shifted the culture of governance.
It shifted the entire focus from personal loyalty to measurable public performance. If case 66 was the execution mechanism, the or else, then case 71 was the rubric. It was the scorecard. The profound constitutional lesson is that setting high objective standards creates a culture of excellence, and it ensures the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of the people.
This is so parallel to modern national performance indicators. The strategic frameworks and governmental scorecards that governments use today. When a government tracks things like infrastructure project or completion rates, or judicial efficiency, or corruption indices, they're following the exact principle from case 71. Governmental effectiveness has to be judged on measurable, empirical data, not just on subjective political opinion. This kind of standardization was a massive leap forward in bureaucratic evolution. Okay, we set up the current operational framework. We know how to make policy, how to spend money, and how to judge performance. Now let's talk about future-proofing. How do you build a government that can survive the inevitable changes in leadership? And that brings us to Section 3, focusing on strategic planning. Case 68 deals with administrative continuity planning.
Right, because instability is most likely to strike during transitions. Whether a governor is promoted or retires or gets removed under case 66, that interim period presents a huge risk. A risk of administrative drift, lost resources, or even policy reversal. Case 68 was a deliberate constitutional decision to mitigate that risk. It mandated specific measures to ensure a smooth, uninterrupted transfer of governmental responsibilities.
The goal was preventing governance gaps. So what specific mechanisms did he mandate to achieve that? Beyond just having the outgoing official tell the new guy what he was working on.
The constitutional mandate centered on the mandatory use of formalized written handover protocols. And this formalized documentation was revolutionary because it fundamentally changed who owned the administrative knowledge. Before this, that knowledge often resided solely in the mind of the official. If he was replaced, his successor was basically starting from scratch. Case 68 made that knowledge the property of the institution.
I see the power in that immediately. The official was legally required to document the state of the Treasury, all the pending judicial cases, any ongoing military campaigns, all the recent policy innovations or exceptions. It's a complete status report.
It's a complete status report. And that handover protocol had to be witnessed, it had to be signed, and a copy had to be sent to the central administration in Medina. This meant the incoming official didn't just walk into a void, they stepped into a structured, documented environment with a clear picture of the situation. This institutionalized memory protected the state from instability during personnel changes. It ensured that the policies from Case 65 and the standards from Case 71 were applied consistently, no matter who held the office.
It effectively makes the system more important than the individual. This is something modern governance still struggles with, right? When a political appointee leaves and takes all their institutional knowledge with them, the system falters. Case 68 institutionalized the concept that the office is paramount, which required this formal, legally mandated separation between the administrator and the administration's own records.
Which is why formal handover protocols, institutional memory systems, and succession planning are so critical in modern organizations, public and private. This decision was arguably the earliest formalized mandate, saying that the functioning of the state cannot depend on the personal recollection of one person. It has to be based on mandatory documentation.
Building on that theme of future-proofing, let's look at Case 69, establishing public administration training. Systems are great, but you need skilled people to run them, and those people need to be systematically developed, not just found by chance.
This decision is about the constitutional requirement for investing in human capital. It's so forward-thinking. Abu Bakr clearly realized that the expertise of that first generation of companions was finite. It was a unique resource that wouldn't last forever. Success, long-term success, required a structured, ongoing process for growth and development to make sure that new administrators had the complex skills needed to manage a rapidly growing state.
Incredible foresight. He was actively grooming the next generation of leaders, people who might not have had that same immediate foundational access to the Prophet, peace be upon him. So how was this training delivered? Was it just informal mentorship, like an apprenticeship, or was there something more like a recognizable curriculum?
It was highly deliberate and systematic. It moved well beyond just informal mentorship. The training focused heavily on specialized administrative knowledge, things like jurisprudence, accounting, which was vital for the fiscal duties in Case 67, and the increasingly complex art of record-keeping required by Cases 68 and 70.
The sources cite Zayd ibn Thabit as a key example. What was it about his training that was so indicative of this constitutional shift?
Well, Zayd ibn Thabit was young, he was exceptionally intelligent, and he was multilingual. He was deliberately identified and prepared for roles that required specialized legal and administrative expertise. His training was a systematic mentorship designed to transmit not just religious principles, but tangible administrative skills. Things like calculating shares and inheritance, which is incredibly complex, documenting treaties, and managing the central treasury records. He was the prototype of the highly skilled, specialized civil servant deliberately prepared to execute these complex governmental functions.
So leadership development became a formalized state function. It was recognized as an essential ongoing investment. The lesson is just undeniable. A state's true growth is inextricably linked to the skills and the continuous development of its people. If you don't institutionalize the training of your replacements and your specialists, the whole system will eventually collapse from a simple lack of competence.
This is the constitutional recognition that investing in education for governance is just as critical as investing in defense or infrastructure. Civil service academies and schools of public policy today are fulfilling this same mandate. They exist to ensure a standardization of knowledge and ethical training. Case 69 was the strategic allocation of state energy and resources toward ensuring generational competence.
So we've established the policy blueprints, we've set performance standards, and we've started training the next generation. Now let's look at the safety features of the system, the permanent structural safeguards that are designed to protect institutional integrity. Case 70 is about innovation documentation and archives.
This is the ultimate defense against what you could call administrative drift or policy amnesia. Case 68 was about transferring instructions during a handover. Case 70 is about preserving the entire body of administrative decisions, records, and procedural improvements in perpetuity. This elevated record-keeping from just a clerical task to a constitutional duty.
Why? Why was documentation elevated to that constitutional weight? What made it a permanent order, rather than just something officials were, generally encouraged to do?
Because without formal state archives, institutional memory is fragile, it's subjective, it's prone to revisionism or just being lost. By issuing specific orders for the preservation and the careful organization of these records, Abu Bakr ensured that all successful administrative innovations were preserved as precedent. So say a governor figures out a particularly effective new method for resolving local tax disputes, or a new legal precedent is set in a judicial case.
You don't want that to be a one-off.
Exactly. You don't want it to just be applied once and then forgotten. It needs to be preserved for future reference, for everyone.
So the records weren't just for history buffs. They were the functional operating manual of the government, safeguarding against repeating past mistakes. And the source material highlights the long-term impact of this. These early record-keeping efforts, they laid the groundwork for the huge compilation projects undertaken by subsequent leaders like Umar and Uthman.
Absolutely. Those later massive compilation projects like codifying certain administrative practices or legal interpretations, they were entirely dependent on the reliable preservation that was mandated by Case 70. This decision institutionalized the concept of precedent as a powerful force in both administrative and judicial law. The lesson is stark. Knowledge preserved is governance protected. If a policy decision is non-negotiable and legally mandated, you have to ensure the evidence of that mandate is permanently available.
That structural safeguard maintains the state's identity across generations, doesn't it? If the archives are lost, the state essentially forgets who it is and how it's supposed to operate.
Precisely. And in today's world, we rely on legislative journals, state archives, and robust digital record systems to fulfill this exact constitutional function, maintaining the foundation of administrative law.
Okay, finally, let's discuss the ultimate safety valve for stability. Case 72, conflict resolution and administrative arbitration. A healthy, dynamic state will always have internal friction. It's inevitable. Between departments, between officials, between the state and its citizens. If you don't manage this constructively, the system can just tear itself apart from the inside.
Conflict is absolutely inevitable when you're managing vast territories and diverse populations with multiple layers of command. You've got governors, military commanders, treasury officials, all with their own purviews. So Case 72 mandated systematic, peaceful methods for managing all of these internal and external disputes. It was about preventing disagreements from festering into political crises or localized rebellions.
What kind of conflicts were the most common? And how did they ensure the resolution process was impartial enough that all parties would actually respect the outcome?
The conflicts were incredibly wide-ranging. You had disputes between governors over provincial borders, which had huge implications for resource collection under Case 67. You had disputes over tax collection methods, and you had citizen complaints against officials, which might be the thing that triggers a Case 66 review. The defined process was mediation and formal arbitration.
And who carried out this crucial role? Who were the mediators?
Well, the conflicts were mediated by senior companions or by specifically designated traveling judges or arbitrators. These individuals possessed deep legal knowledge, jurisprudence, and, just as importantly, high moral authority. And crucially, they were external to the immediate conflict. They would travel from the capital or be appointed specifically to mediate, which ensured impartiality. And it ensured consistency because they were applying the unified legal and policy standards established back in cases 65 and 71.
So instead of leaving disputes to be handled arbitrarily by whoever was the most powerful official involved, which would completely undermine central authority, the state provided a formal, fair, and accessible mechanism for resolution. This sounds an awful lot like an early system of administrative law designed to protect citizens against government overreach.
That is the core takeaway. This process established the citizens' right to challenge administrative actions, and it ensured that interdepartmental friction was managed structurally, not through internal power struggles. The constitutional lesson here is profound. True stability comes from resolving conflicts fairly, consistently, and systematically, rather than just trying to suppress the underlying tensions. It institutionalized the idea that accountability wasn't just a stick held by the center, it was also a right held by the populace.
And this resonates so strongly with contemporary administrative tribunals, ombudsman systems, and official mediation councils today. They exist to handle state-citizen disagreements and ensure that administrative actions can be challenged and remedied through a formal, non-judicial process. Case 72 established that structural right to administrative arbitration. It was about cementing peace through process.
It solidified the idea that the caliphate was not just an expanding military force, but a functioning legal system committed to internal justice.
This has been a really deep dive into the architecture of stability, a lot to process. We've covered 8 fundamental constitutional decisions that transformed an emergent state into a highly structured, sustainable governmental system. Let's just quickly synthesize those 8 architectural pillars we've defined in cases 65 through 72.
Okay. We started with the intellectual and financial structure. First, deliberate consultative policymaking from Case 65, which mandates how decisions are even made, and then fair and strategic resource allocation from Case 67, which dictates how the state's budget prioritizes justice and equity for the vulnerable. So those two define what the state does and how it decides to do it.
Right. Then we moved into the ethical and operational requirements for the current administration. We had quality control of government performance in Case 66, which introduced that systematic monitoring and removal, and defining governance standards in Case 71, setting those clear, measurable benchmarks for excellence. These two ensure the system functions with integrity and produces tangible results.
Next, we focused on the strategic future-proofing. Clear continuity planning from Case 68, mandating those formalized handovers to create institutional memory, and training future administrators from Case 69, ensuring the systematic development of skilled human capital to actually run this complex machinery.
And finally, we covered the structural safeguards that protect the system itself, documenting decisions and innovations in Case 70 to preserve precedent and institutional knowledge, and structured conflict resolution mechanisms in Case 72 to manage that internal friction peacefully and maintain overall stability.
And when you look at all 8 of these decisions together, you really see the magnitude of Abu Bakr's foresight. He was not just reacting to the day-to-day challenges of governing new territory. He was consciously, deliberately designing a sustainable, long-term governmental system. That transition from necessary reaction during the early conflicts to deliberate constitutional design, that represents his most enduring architectural achievement. He provided the administrative scaffolding for all subsequent Islamic states to build upon.
The ultimate lesson really seems to be that great leaders don't just wait for the future to happen. They build it piece by piece, policy by policy. And Abu Bakr As-Siddiq built it on a foundation of wisdom, justice, and this profound strategic foresight. He created a model of governance that prioritized long-term resilience and integrity over short-term political expediency.
And that resilience is rooted in the structural definitions we've just discussed, the clear performance metrics, and the formalized process for managing disagreement. Without those systems in place, any attempt at compassionate governance is just, well, it's just temporary. It won't last.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to carry forward from this. Consider how a state's ability to clearly define its performance standards, like in Case 71, and to resolve its internal conflicts through impartial arbitration, like in Case 72. How those two things are fundamentally a prerequisite for successfully implementing compassionate welfare governance and ensuring true legal independence for its citizens. It's the framework of integrity and stability that enables the framework of compassion to actually take root and last.